This sermon is based on Exodus chapter 34, which if you could please read it before you listen to this sermon. There should be a link below the screen. The title of this sermon is The Revelation and the Response. The words "we need to have a talk" are the second most scary words any husband can hear. Upon hearing these words, every husband knows he's either left the toilet seat up or committed the unforgivable sin of putting the empty box of tea bags back in the cupboard after taking the last one. The words "we need to have a talk" are the second most scary words any husband can hear. The even more scary sentence is, "We need to have a talk. Bring a bit of paper and a pen." We all know what's coming, a dreaded list of "thou shall" and "thou shall nots." What might the wife ask to be written on that bit of paper? "Thou shalt not open the new milk before finishing the old." "Thou shalt not demand to be praised for hanging out the washing when your wife does it every week." "Thou shalt not ask your wife in the morning how she slept after you kept her up all night with your snoring." The words "we need to have a talk, bring a bit of pen and paper," well, these are the most scary words any husband can hear. Why? Because if the husband must perfectly do everything on the list to secure a relationship with his wife, every man is doomed to fail. When God invited Moses up Mount Sinai, God told Moses to bring a bit of paper and a pen. For Moses was to bring 2 stone tablets on which God was to rewrite the 10 Commands. This could have been a scary scene, because Israel had already broken God's commandments. For moments after the first 10 commandments were written, Israel indulged in both idolatry and adultery, failing both to love God and love others. And since we share the same sinful nature as these Israelites, God's writing of the 10 Commands could be very bad news indeed. If Israel's relationship with God, if my relationship with God, if your relationship with God is dependent on you and I successfully obeying the 10 Commandments perfectly, God might as well write out the divorce papers now. But the good news of chapters 33 and 34, and indeed the whole Bible, is that our relationship with God isn't based on our doing. It's based on what God has done for us instead. As God explained to Moses after Moses requests to see God's glory for himself, "I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." It's only because of God's mercy and God's compassion that any of us can have a relationship with God. And any subsequent obedience to God is in response to what God has done for us. As we learn in chapter 34, we obey God not to secure a relationship with God or put us in his favour. Instead, obedience to God is in response. Obedience to God is in response to what God has done, in response to who God is, and in response to what God will do. So firstly, obedience in response to who God is. Moses goes up to God with his pen and paper, but before telling Moses what he and the people are to do, God shows Moses who he is. God being compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, forgiving and yet just. And it is in response to who God is that Moses speaks these words. Verse 9, "Lord, take us as your inheritance." Moses says to God, "Lord, take us as your inheritance." strange words to our ears, but just think about what an inheritance is. An inheritance is all your money, all you own, and all your rights. And when you give that to somebody, usually at death, you are literally handing over all you own to someone else. And so when Moses says to God, "Lord, take us as your inheritance," he is literally saying to God, take our everything and our all, even though we are still alive. Take all of our rights, all that we own, all of our time. God, take the whole lot. I surrender all. Now I know we like singing the hymn, I Surrender All, on a Sunday, but let's be honest, do we really mean it? Do we really want to let God have access to every area of our lives? Do we really want God to have the right to ask anything of us? The only way we'll join Moses in saying, "Lord, take us as your inheritance." The only way we'll sing, "I surrender all," and actually mean it. The only way we'll give God our everything is if we realise just who God is. And who is God? God is compassionate, feeling the same depth of concern for you as an expectant mother feels for her unborn child. God is gracious, showing us his good favour, even though we do not deserve it. God is slow to anger. Unlike the person who is quick to condemn us, and unlike a half-friend who does not care enough about us to be frank with us about our sin. Unlike these, God cares about us enough to get angry about our sin, whilst also giving us the time and the help to change. God is abounding in love and faithfulness. Name any other friendship in which the other person is entirely selfless. Name any other friend who always keeps their promises and is there for you all the time. Ring them up at 3 a.m. in the morning and see how they react. And yet, God overflows in love for us and desires nothing less than our good. And every promise he makes, he keeps. Take a moment just to let who God is sink in. Now tell me this, how many of you, when you go to the supermarket, don't go for the grapes, but go for the juicy grapes? You don't go for the simple chocolate bar, but you go for the quality melt-in-your-mouth chocolate experience. You don't go for the coffee made in a factory in Kent. You go for the rich and flavoursome coffee beans freshly harvested from an Ethiopian field. When we go to the shops, we suss out the best option and then surrender our cash. Why should it be any different with God? Is there anyone better you could offer your life to? Is there any greater thing in which you could dedicate your life? When you realise just who God is, the only right response is to surrender your life to him, for there is nobody better you could serve. Now let's move from the general, surrendering your life, to the specific. Are there things in your life that take greater priority? Are there areas in your life you'd rather God would not interfere? Do you hold back from surrendering your all because you're concerned about the consequences? Do you ever debate if obeying God is always worthwhile? When Moses saw God's glory, his immediate response was worship and total surrender. The next time you find yourself reluctant to do the same, remind yourself of just who God is. There is nobody better you could serve than him. Not only that, remind yourself of what God has done. My second point, obedience in response to what God has done. Before Moses can even begin talking to Israel about doing something for God, Moses must first ask God to do something for them. Verse 9, Lord, he said, if I have found favour in your eyes, then let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, forgive our wickedness and our sin, and take us as your inheritance. Moses first asks God to do something, forgive our wickedness and our sin. Moses first asks God to do something for them before he asks God to take us as your inheritance. And it's an understanding of who God is that leads Moses to pray this prayer. For God describes himself as a God who maintains love to thousands and forgives wickedness, rebellion and sin. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Now we all love the first part of this sentence that speaks of God's love and forgiveness. We're not so keen on the second part, which speaks of God punishing the guilty. But remember, God said to Moses in chapter 33 verse 19, God said to Moses, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you. You cannot appreciate all of God's goodness unless you realize that God is both forgiving and just. Just think for a minute. Why do you get fined for stealing... Why do you get fined for stealing a £10 note, but not get fined for stealing a blank bit of paper? Why? Because one bit of paper has value and the other bit of paper does not. If an employee at Primark has a hard day and then asks the boss's permission to kick a clothes mannequin, the Primark boss might allow it. You know, it's only a clothes mannequin after all. It doesn't matter if you kick it, or how hard. But if that same Primark employee has a hard day and kicks a customer, he'll be sacked. Why the different reactions? Because the life of the customer has value, whereas the life of a mannequin does not. Now ask yourself this question. How does God have value? How worthy is he? The biblical answer is that God is infinitely glorious and infinitely great. In other words, God has value. And it is because God has value that God does not leave the guilty unpunished. For the rejection of an infinitely great God is an infinitely great crime. He gave us our life, our breath and our everything, after all. And yet, only a few moments earlier in the story, Israel had committed this crime. Despite all God's goodness to them, in Exodus 32 we read of Israel worshipping a calf rather than God, and abusing God's gift of sex for self-centered reasons. And though you may or may not have committed either of these in the last week, if there was a swab test for who of us had sinned in the last 48 hours, all of us would come back positive. Mine would come back positive if it tested for sin in the last 48 minutes. We also desperately need God's forgiveness, and yet we've also heard that God is just. And so the only way we can be forgiven is if God pays the price of our infinite sin himself. And the good news is God has paid this price, but only by giving up something of infinite worth. In 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 18 to 19 we read these words. You know that God paid a ransom, that is, paid the price. You know that God paid a ransom to save you. And it was not paid with mere gold or silver, which lose their value. It was the precious blood of Christ, the sinless, spotless Lamb of God. God has infinite value. Therefore our sin deserves infinite punishment. But God chose to pay the infinite price himself. How? Through God giving up something of infinite value, the life of his one and only Son. For those of you for whom this is new news, understand this. Verse 7 is written in God's order of preference. That's why God describes himself as maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion and sin, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. Forgiveness is God's preferred option A. Punishment is God's least favoured option B. That's why churches have posters saying salvation rather than condemnation. That's why people say heaven and hell in that order. Forgiveness, salvation and heaven are God's option A for you. All he asks is that you accept it. For some of you this might be new news, but for some of you it might be wonderful news, but familiar. For those of you to whom this is good news, to whom this is familiar news, I'd like you to think about the practical response to this. After you prayed, Lord, forgive my wickedness and my sin, should you and I not also be joining Moses in his prayer? Lord, forgive our wickedness and sin, and take us as your inheritance. Moses not only surrendered his all in response to who God is, Moses also surrendered his all in response to what God had done. For God had rescued Israel from Egypt via the blood of the Passover lamb, and God was already providing Israel with a route to forgiveness through the sacrificial system that would go on in the temple. And since we, as New Testament believers, know of an even greater sacrifice and an even greater lamb, our practical response should only be the same, or even better, more. Saying to God, Lord, take me as your inheritance. Lord, I surrender all. Lord, I die to my own will and give you permission to command of me anything that you like. Yes, I'll put the toilet seat back down out of compliance. Yes, occasionally I'll put the washing out to dry out of guilt. We all follow rules and commands reluctantly and out of pressure. But the reason for Christian obedience is entirely different. As Paul says in Romans chapter 12, therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, in other words, in view of all that God has done for you, offer your lives as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. God gave up his all for us. How could you and I give up anything less for him? Again, let's leave the general and get specific. Surrendering your all does not mean we all go to be missionaries or give ourselves to full-time Christian service. Instead, the 10 Commandments, as well as with all biblical commandments, get down to the very nitty-gritty of ordinary daily life. Surrendering our all has to do with the things we do as part of our daily lives. How do we treat our spouse if we have one? Does the compassion God has shown us influence us? When we're exposed to the most simplest of human needs, are we reluctant and resistant? Or do we respond in view of God's grace towards you and me? How do we respond to being hurt? Are we slow to anger, gentle and patient? After all, God showed us all three. Are we committed to anything more than our own comfort? Or are we faithfully committed to the welfare of our Christian brothers and sisters, both abroad and in this room? Do we love anything a lot? How does our love of God compared to that. Living this type of life is suicide unless you know who God is and how good a master he is. Living this life is impossible unless you know what God has done for you. Only then are you enabled to love God and others. That's why only after Moses understood who God is, and only with an understanding of what God had done, only after these two things does God command Moses to put pen to paper and write out the commands that follow. Why? Because obedience to God is never done out of guilt or out of unwilling compliance or force. Instead, it is in response to what God has done, and it's in response to who God is, as well as a response to what God will do in the future. Chapter 34, verses 10 and 11. Then the Lord said, I am making a covenant with you. Before all the people I will do wonders never before in any nation in the world. The people you live among will see how awesome is the work I, the Lord, will do for you. Obey what I command you today. Obedience is done in response to who God is, in response to what God has done, and in response to what God will do for us in the future. When we appreciate these things, then we obey God out of appreciation and love.